Great to see so many people here, particularly several of our research affiliates, including our next star performer, Yael Bélanger, who's going to be giving a talk on, come on in, there are plenty of chairs over here, who's going to be giving his brown bag, I'll pass this around, on 16th of February. Yeah. So this is one of 5 brown bags we're having this, the Prentice Institute is having this term. Plus, tomorrow, we are co-sponsoring the Dreger lecture with several other sponsors, and that will be Dr. Sinha, who's going to be talking about the abolition of Indian indentured labor in the British Empire, which is great, but her flight from Detroit was canceled this morning, so she hopefully will get in. It wasn't the flight to Lethbridge, it was a flight from Detroit. So hopefully, she's from the University of Michigan, so that's the good thing, she knows about cold weather. So she will be coming in hopefully late tonight, I guess. So I hope you will come to that, and I hope you will come to Yale's brown bag. And then we have 2 more after that. We're going to have 2 more research affiliate talks. One will be by Julia Brasilato in Health Sciences. Come in, please. It's okay. Welcome. There's lots of chairs. And she's going to be talking about her project on rural health for older people. And then we're going to have John Usher, who's also a research affiliate with Apprentice, who's going to be talking on his project on local food. So lots is happening. I didn't say who I am, so some of you, most everybody knows me, but I'm Susan McDaniel. I have cat in the hat titles, but here I am director of the Prentice Institute for Global Population and Economy. And I want to thank Associate Director Alex Darku, who could come because it's Thursday instead of Friday when he teaches, who ran the place while I was away for 6 months. So thank him. And I want to thank Jeff, who's an assistant now, for being Jeff of everything. Because he's in charge of the camera, he moves the tables, he does everything. So we call him Jeff of everything, and we're very grateful to you. So enough of that. I will pass this around. There is a SACPA talk. We affiliate with SACPA quite a lot. They're great people. Member here is from SACPA. On Thursday, the 8th of February, they advertise our things, so we thought we would advertise their things. Dr. Leroy Littlebear is going to talk about bison roaming southern Alberta and northern Montana, so that should be interesting. So I'll pass these around, and Boko here is sitting on this form, but you can share that with people if you want to be put on our reading list, our mailing list. Dr. Hanrahan is our latest Prentice Research Affiliate, as is Yael Bélanger, so we welcome you, and that's very important. But she also has other titles. She's Board of Governors Research Chair, Tier 2, and Associate Professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies here at the university. She's also an adjunct professor at Memorial University's Environmental Policy Institute. And while at Memorial, she was a special advisor to the President for Aboriginal Affairs at Memorial. And what I discovered yesterday is that the president of Memorial with whom she worked was Vice President of Research at the University of Alberta when I was there. So it's a very small country, this country we live in. Yeah. So she's won a number of awards for her writing, and she has oodles of books. That's the best way to describe it, oodles of books. How you do all these books, I don't know, but it's very impressive. So she's going to talk today, and I do apologize for the brief introduction. She's going to talk today on water governance in Canada. Same theme, slightly different title, Rural, Remote, and Indigenous Communities. So we welcome you, Maura, and thanks for coming.
Thank you, Dr. McDaniel, and thank you to the Prentice Institute, and thank you all for coming, because I know how busy everyone is, so I do appreciate the fact that you're here. I'd like to acknowledge that we are in Métis Region 5, and that this is Blackfoot territory as well. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about water policy globally, then move into water security in Canada, especially water disparities, and I will focus on Indigenous and rural remote communities. I'll take you through source water protection as a way to work through policy in Canada, and I'll finish up with a case study of an Inuit community in Labrador. So I'm kind of moving in and out of case studies and policies and policy, but we like to loop around in the Indigenous world the way we communicate. So globally, water access is recognized as a human right. In 2002, the United Nations ratified something called the comment number 15, which defined the right to water, and they defined it as the right of everyone to sufficient, safe, acceptable, and physically accessible and affordable water for personal and domestic use. And there are many other definitions of water security. Newer definitions incorporate cultural aspects to water security as well. But my point here is that water security should be at the center of water policy and governance. So that should be the starting point. 10 years later, the UN goes further in 2010 when the General Assembly adopted Resolution 64292, which explicitly recognized the human right to water and sanitation and acknowledged that clean drinking water and sanitation are essential to the realization of human rights. Okay, so here in Canada, many people, not all of us, but many people think that everybody can turn on the tap and we've got lovely clean water that we can drink anytime and that we can access to our heart's content. But that isn't actually the case. Safe drinking water is something that not all Canadians can take for granted. And we know that water security is compromised in many Indigenous communities and in many rural, remote communities as well. Access to clean water is an ongoing problem, and so is water quality. So about 5,000 homes, and this changes constantly, but I'm giving you data from the past few years. About 5,000 homes in First Nations communities throughout the country lack basic water and sewer services, so they don't have a tap to turn on. So that's about, let's say, 20,000 people. So it's the size of a good-sized town. And according to one study, First Nations homes on reserve are 90 times more likely to have contaminated water. And as we go through the process, I'll try and explain how that happens. So access to water is a problem, and so is water quality, like I said. Another study says that over 75% of water on reserve, water systems on reserve run the risk of contamination. Excuse me. In 2010, there were more than 100 reserves that had boil water advisories. A boil water advisory, I don't know if people know what they are. You can drink your water after you boil it. So it's an added task to your day. So they had, when I say ongoing boil water advisories, I mean of at least 2 weeks or so. So there would have been 100 communities, 100 reserves in 2010 that had that situation. And the number has decreased recently because of initiatives by the federal government, so I'm very glad to say that. But there are many, many boil water advisories on reserve in Canada today, meaning that Indigenous communities disproportionately suffer water insecurity in Canada. And this is water injustice, and it contributes to health disparities. So for instance, the Federal, Provincial, and Territorial Advisory Committee on Population Health says that the incidence of waterborne diseases is several times higher in First Nations communities than in the general population, in part because of inadequate or non-existing water treatment systems. So the detrimental health effects associated with this kind of water insecurity and poor water infrastructure is elevated rates of psychological stress, to which I'll return, influenza, whooping cough, pertussis, and skin infections, among other health issues. And in the literature, there's a lot of focus on health, especially physical health, but I'm going to come around to this when I look at my case study to show you that water insecurity has many more impacts besides health. Not that health is health, of course, is right up there on top. And water insecurity is a problem for rural, remote communities as well, in some provinces more than others. So this is a boil water advisory map, and this changes every day. You can go online and see who's off a BWA and who's on a BWA. Most of these you'll see are in British Columbia. Almost all of them are on reserves. Excuse me. At the community level, and you'll see some provinces have more problems than others. So I'll talk a little bit about that. The province that I'm going to talk to you most about is my home province, Newfoundland and Labrador, right here, which probably has the most extreme water insecurity problems of any province. So I don't know how many of you have been to Newfoundland and Labrador. It's the 9th largest island in the world. It's very, very big. It's 3.5 times the size of the 3 maritime provinces put together. So it doesn't look that big on a map, but it's actually a vast territory. And so St. John's, where the capital is, this would be a 12-hour drive, and probably a 10-hour drive, maybe 12 up the peninsula as well. And Labrador, to drive across Labrador, you're probably looking at 40 hours, although these communities are all on the coast, they're all fly-in only. Excuse me. So once you leave St. John's, right there on the eastern edge, you're essentially in a territory in terms of population size, 500,000 people, distribution, very, very sparse, infrastructure, service delivery, all those kinds of things. It's more like a territory than a province. And it's a resource extraction economy with very little agriculture, and it's hit quite hard with ongoing effects of the 1992 groundfish moratorium. Excuse me. So here's what it looks like. We have a lot of subarctic tundra, and we have a lot of boreal forest on the island. So in Newfoundland and Labrador, there are 2 forms of community government. One is municipal government or municipalities. They would have paid staff with water-related duties. The other form is called a local service district, or LSD, and an LSD would be run by volunteers, no money for paid staff. And generally, size determines whether you'll have a municipality or an LSD. And most rural remote communities have LSDs, and we have a lot of rural remote communities. Let's see. Some communities have no governance structure at all, and what they might have is a water committee, or they might form an ad hoc water committee, usually in response to a crisis, and that's fairly common. So only 15% of LSDs monitor their water. So that means that 85% of the LSDs don't monitor their water. So people are drinking water that is unmonitored, and that is a concern. There are dozens of boil water advisories in Newfoundland and Labrador at any one time. So yesterday there were 150 active boil water advisories. They can change by the day, although they tend to change a little bit slower in this province, in Newfoundland and Labrador. So at any one time you have about 22-25% of all the communities on boil water advisories in the province. Excuse me. In contrast, yesterday there were 9 boil water advisories in Alberta, only 9. Now they were all on reserve. Every single one of them was on reserve in Alberta. There were 3 boil water advisories in New Brunswick yesterday, and there were none in PEI. So good for PEI. On paper, and that map I showed earlier, BC looks like it has a lot of boil water advisories. In BC, they count them, if a single house has non-potable water per day. That will count as a BWA. So the numbers look high. Yesterday, BC had 309, but that included a lot of houses that are off the grid, people, living in the woods and so on. Provincial parks. It includes sometimes people's summer homes and that kind of thing. So BC, when you boil it down, it's really their problem is mostly First Nations reserves again. So you see that pattern right across the country. Now, many of the boil water advisories in Newfoundland and Labrador are long-standing. The oldest one that I'm aware of is 28 years, but there are many that have lasted upwards of 20 years, upwards of 15 years, and so on. And the problem with that, well, there are many problems with that, but one problem is that people get desensitized to it. So you have an entire generation growing up on a boil water advisory, and they don't bother to boil their water. They get sick of it. They get tired of it. People stop doing it. They get slack, as you would, and of course, they're potentially compromising their health when they do that. So water infrastructure and operations are expensive, and the settlement in Newfoundland, Indigenous and European, it took place along an 11,000-mile coastline to service the fishing industry, the inshore fishery. And that industry is no longer very active, and you have a lot of long-term rural unemployment since 1992. But the communities are still there, and the settlement pattern still persists, and you have to deliver water to them and other services, roads and so on. It's very expensive. The rural communities tend to be supported by remittance economies and by commuter economies. And when I say commuter, I mean they're commuting to Fort McMurray. It's very, very long distance commuting. 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, 6 weeks on, 6 weeks off, that kind of thing. So that's a little bit about rural and remote. So let's look at water policy in Canada. And then I'm going to bring it to bear on one community experience. So Canada has one of the world's most decentralized water governance systems, and it's the only OECD country that doesn't have legally enforceable national drinking water standards. So Canada's federal water policy, dating from 1987, it's been largely ignored by governments, and it remains little more than a statement of good intentions. Now, the Constitution of Canada, I'm going to open that can of worms, it delegates powers for water management to the provinces, primarily to the provincial level. So each of the provinces and territories will have their own system. So you'll see very much a patchwork quilt across the country, and we see that in many other ways as well. So they're independent, decentralized systems. Now, this policy context, or this gap, or this vacuum, whatever you want to call it, it creates many, many challenges of integration, coordination, even data access. I pointed out how BC collects their boil water advisories differently from Newfoundland and Labrador does, for instance. So you really you can't just look at the numbers. You have to dig down and see how they're collected and how they're defined and so on. And this decentralization, it has negative impacts on Canada's ability to manage water resources effectively. So to put it bluntly, Canada's legislative and governance frameworks are not sufficiently robust to manage domestic water issues effectively. So water responsibilities get pushed down the ladder. At the provincial level, responsibilities have increasingly devolved to lower levels of government, to municipalities. And this is explained as following the principles of I always have trouble saying this, subsidiarity and co-management. And they're nice words, but we're really talking about offloading water responsibilities from governments that are better resourced and capable to governments at the local level that are not very well resourced. So in this way, water governance reflects and both reinforces the neoliberal agenda. And one of the big concerns is that because of this, there's a lack of accountability with regard to drinking water in Canada. Now I'm going to go back to reserves. And reserves, this is a little different for reserves, because what I've talked about there is rural remote. With reserves, every aspect of life is controlled by the Indian Act. And Canada's fiduciary responsibility to First Nations includes water security. But there's insufficiently funded water infrastructure on reserves. And capacity at the local level is not developed. This has been recently highlighted by a Senate committee. And further, sometimes people are surprised to learn this, but oftentimes the water infrastructure on reserve, it's too big, it's too large, it has too much capacity for what is needed, so it doesn't reflect needs. The scale is all wrong. And because the scale is wrong, it's too expensive, too complex, and then it's got impacts for the human resources capacity and for financial capacity. And this is something that the Ontario government recently recognized. Excuse me, so Kathleen Wynne is paying a little bit of attention to that. So, excuse me. Let's zero in on source water protection and to track how policy works. So source water protection is very much, you see it all over the literature, and it's very much favored and promoted by policymakers. And in some ways, that's a good thing. So source water protection is about protecting the source water, preventing it from getting contaminated at the source and as it goes through the process to be delivered to people. And the idea is that it's more rational to prevent contamination at the source than it is to respond to a problem afterwards. And that is common sense. So I've got a slide here with a picture of the report of the Walkerton Inquiry, and the emphasis on source water protection in Canada comes largely as a result of what happened at Walkerton. So in 2000, Walkerton, Ontario, 8 people died as a result of water contamination, and many other people became ill. So source water protection prevents contamination by mitigating land use activities around the source water. So it's meant to protect drinking water quality. And so the source water protection process, it might include mapping, risk assessment, public education, infrastructure improvements, permitting for development, and banning potentially damaging land use activities like golf courses, for instance, in designated areas. So the emphasis is very much on prevention. But source water protection is very much underutilized in Canada, even though we talk a lot about it. And it's especially underutilized in Indigenous communities and rural remote communities as well. And the underutilization of source water protection is a part of the poor water governance patterns that we see across the country. So a lot of the literature calls for more education around source water protection, and that's there's certainly some scope for development there. In one study, over half of the water operators or people responsible for water operators in local governments said that there were no threats to their source water. So they're making an assumption there. There are always potential threats to source water wherever you happen to be. Now, some people understand it, and though the people who did understand it, the other 50%, they cited activities like recreational use, domestic wood cutting, hunting and fishing, those kinds of things that could impact source water quality. But everyone at the municipal level or community government level should know that there are always threats to source water quality. And community health is only part of the answer, however. And I think the crux of the problem is a mismatch between the responsibilities and capacity at the community level. So what I mean is that communities are primarily responsible for the provision of supplies of drinking water, but they can't manage this responsibility. They don't have the financial and human resource capacity to manage it. They have inadequate funding from senior governments, provincial governments in the case of rural remote communities, and the federal government in the case of First Nations reserves. So in largely rural provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador, local water management agencies and even small communities are almost solely responsible for water governance, for system maintenance, and for operations. So they will be responsible for the daily testing of chlorine residual, for instance, and the implementation of source water protection. Now, remote communities are generally quite small, and they take on tasks that should really be in the province's domain at the least, like the collection of bacteriological samples. So in Newfoundland and Labrador, the provincial government funds the infrastructure. They fund the capital investments, the construction of whatever units are needed, whatever systems are needed and installed, but then they don't fund operations. So, and this varies across the country, like I said, a real patchwork. They don't fund operations and maintenance. So annual operations for a small community, one I'm thinking of in particular, of 150 people, you're looking at $25,000 to $40,000. That's very, very hard, if not impossible, for rural remote communities to come up with. They tend to have limited tax bases and aging populations. So a lot of people have aged out of the labor force. And many rural remote communities in Canada, certainly in my home province, they don't have the ability to raise taxes under legislation. So the LSDs that I mentioned, the local service districts, can't raise taxes. And we need to remember that water is a right. Go back to the United Nations; it recognizes it as a right. So it's not something that you have to earn or deserve, not something that you should have to pay for as an individual or as a household if you don't have the ability to pay. So the high degree of offloading from senior to lesser resourced junior governments means that this right to water is not being honored. So Kelly Vodden and Sarah Minnis, two water researchers, they've written, the ability of small communities to fully meet their mandated drinking water responsibilities is virtually impossible with existing human and financial resources. So long-term boil water advisories that I've mentioned earlier, they're quite clearly an example of how that plays out. So what I'd like to turn to next is a case study of an Inuit community in Labrador that I've worked with for many years. And here, this is Labrador, again, although the map doesn't make it so, but it's quite a large territory. So this is a fly-in community. It's on the coast. It's that little bump there where you see that bump is. It's an island on the coast. It's called Black Tickle. And the island is called the Island of Ponds, but it's actually quite a deceptive name because the ponds are about this big, and there's no running water. It's all still water. It's just depressions in igneous rock, so the water just tends to sit there, not potable. So the Inuit people were relocated to this island as part of a provincial government resettlement program, which I don't know, but I think it disproportionately, again, affected Indigenous people in the province. So they had practiced seasonal transhumance. They had moved with the seasons to access wood resources, fur-bearing animals, fish, and so on. And in the 1960s, they were told that you have to stay in one place year-round and send your children to school or you will lose them. So they moved, the priest and the provincial government decided that they would be on Island of Ponds, which was their summer residence. And that's where they moved, but there was no potable water there. And it was very much a top-down decision. Having said that, the people have become very, very attached to Island of Ponds since then and do go back to their former winter communities when they can. So when it was resettled, there were about 250 people there and no potable water and no piped water. So this is the 1960s. Nobody thought to put piped water in, and it would be very, very difficult to do because you're on igneous rock. They could have used more later. They could have used Arctic hose, which is very expensive, and that's the government's argument right now. It's just too expensive to do that. So how do they get water in Black Tickle? Okay, so there's Island of Ponds. So this is where the community is. I'm gonna show you the water treatment plant. I'll come back to that. They do eventually get a water treatment plant, but here's how you get water. You use your all-terrain vehicle, and the roads are pretty bad. The road, it's not paved or anything. So your all-terrain vehicle, and you use these big buckets and go to a stream or a brook and fetch water. Or you can use a komatik, and that would be attached to a snowmobile. And it's quite expensive to run a snowmobile or an all-terrain vehicle, gas, lube, parts, and so on. So water retrieval becomes very, very expensive. Water is collected in salt beef buckets. I don't know if you guys know what salt beef buckets are. You do? Okay, good. Yeah. Okay, so these, people try to keep them clean, but you can't keep them clean. So once water leaves, say, a potable dispensing water unit, and it goes into a container that isn't clean, well, then water quality is immediately compromised. So here's another way they get water: community wells. These are very, very shallow because you hit the igneous rock there, very little soil, and this is ice buildup. So actually, people have fallen in these wells. And this is Black Tickle, Labrador, but in Inuit communities across the north, many of them would have similar ways of water retrieval and so on. So these are community wells. Nobody owns them. There's no sense of ownership or no notion of private ownership in Inuit culture, really. So everything's communal and shared, each according to their needs. So that's how they would get water from the 1960s right up until 2002. Sometimes they would go to brooks that are up to 25 kilometers away, and in the winter you would have to use an ice auger and drill down into a pond maybe that's 10 or 12 kilometers away and haul water up that way. It's very cold. You have to use your bare hands. I do anyway when I was there, because I'm not very good. You lose your dexterity when you've got gloves on, so your hands would be very, very cold. I can feel it now. So the quality of the water is compromised. The quantity of the water is compromised because it's just so labor intensive and so hard to get. So people store water. Again, this also compromises water quality. So all the houses, you'll see water stored up like that. And they do that because of storms. Because you could easily be storm-bound for 3 or 4 days in your house in Labrador with the storm. So there always has to be a lot of water on hand in case that happens. So in the early 2000s, the community formed a Concerned Citizens Committee, the CCC, and they agitated and lobbied and so on, and they wanted their water security system improved. So they were successful in getting a potable water drinking unit built in the community, or PUDU we call them, PDWU, PUDU, anyway, there you go. So that's quite small. That would be probably, both of those buildings, probably a third of the size of this room. And they're quite a long ways away from the community. Oops, wait now. Okay, so this is about a mile, and a lot of this is very marshy, so you can't really walk through it. Well, you have to have very good hip rubbers on and so on. The nearest house would be around, there's a couple of houses around here, but it's built a long ways away. And so they had lobbied the provincial government for a long time. And one day, the guys from the provincial government showed up in a couple of helicopters and just built that thing. They just built the unit. And they didn't talk to the people about where they were going to put the unit. And it's such a long way from the community. And they put it near Martin's Pond, which is the source water. At the edge of the island. But if you had asked the people, they wouldn't have wanted it there, and they would have pointed out that the location is problematic. Another problem with lack of consultation is that you do have to take culture into account. So there's a strong cultural belief there that if water looks really pure and clear, that it's clean. And we know that the things you can't see are what you need to worry about in terms of water. But so that belief that needs to be dealt with, and it is, people are understanding that more and more. But it's the kind of thing that when you're doing community development, you have to take into account. So that wasn't done. Oh. Okay. And here again, like in Ontario, in Northern Ontario, the PUDU is too big for the community. They don't need this. This is $100,000 to build. It's $30,000 a year to operate. It's not even necessary. There's only 150 people there. So I had an engineer on the research team with us, and the first thing he said when he got there, this is way too big. The scale is way too big. And that's what's happened all across the Canadian North. So because it's so big, it's expensive, and it's very complicated. When the parts break down, they have to come from Israel, which is a long, I don't know why. It's a long way from Labrador, and it takes a while to get there, and the community just doesn't have the money to have extra parts on hand. Not even the small little water filters. They run out of those pretty quickly. So they've tried user fees. The unit gives you general use water for showering in and washing your walls and so on, and your clothes. And then you can, from this part of it, you can get potable drinking water. So because it's so expensive to run, they tried to raise money themselves. They tried to charge $2 a liter for drinking water. Now that didn't work. What happened was that people couldn't afford it, so they would go back to the brooks and the streams and the community wells and compromise their health and so on. And all across the north, you see quite low cash incomes. So we did a survey of this community in 2014, and the average household income was $11,000 a year. So every cent counts, and $2 a liter was not going to work. So the system's beyond community capacity in every way. And in practice, what happens is every year the local service district will apply for crisis funding. There's a water crisis. And the water crisis is we don't have any money to run the thing. So the province gives them a grant, sends them a letter every year. This is the last year that you'll be getting this funding, and so on. And you're expected to raise your own money. But it's very stressful, and they have to write up a big proposal, and many of us in this room know what it's like to write a proposal. So it's very labor intensive. And crisis driven, and think of the psychology of that, right? What that does to people. So the other thing I wanted to mention was that water insecurity in communities can result in multi-dimensional consequences, there are many dimensions of water insecurity, many consequences. So I've talked a little bit about the adverse health consequence. There are also economic consequences and social and cultural impacts as well. So one of these for the Inuit is that, and it's difficult to describe, and it took me a long time being in the community to realize it, but it very much impacts your relationship with the land and your identity if water becomes a problem. So it interrupts that harmony that Inuit want to see in their relationship with the land and the land as home. And it's got deep, this causes a lot of emotional responses and psychological stress, I believe. Financially, this situation here with water, having to pay gas and lube and so on to go get water, it impacts people's finances. And the only elastic part of a household budget is food. So they're really choosing at times between food and water. So food security is very much impacted in that community. And I know people will make a choice to get water or buy food. I've seen that happen. Community development is completely stunted. You can't start a bed and breakfast. You can't have a takeout or a restaurant. Anything like that, because you need water. You need potable water for those to get a license to operate any kind of business. So it's completely stunted in that regard. And there are people who would like to do things and they can't. And another thing that happens is because this is a very harsh climate. So I know of elders who've had to leave the community to move to Happy Valley Goose Bay, which is it's a small town of about 10,000 people in the center of Labrador. It's the main service sector. But they've had to leave Black Tickle because water retrieval is just too hard for them. And it's very gendered, water retrieval. And unlike many countries, it's the men who retrieve the water. So if they've got a son who's working away and coming back and forth, when he's absent, it's just too difficult to get water. So a lot of elders have had to leave the community, and if you think about that, the generations, you're losing a large part of it, a very important generation, the elders, right? And the community history and so on. Physical health, I'll come back to that. According to WHO standards, World Health Organizations, people in this community, and it's representative of other Inuit communities as well. They're not taking enough water. They're not drinking enough water on a daily basis for health. Well below WHO standards. And virtually every man in the community has muscular skeletal problems. Because if you've ever tried to carry a bucket of water, you know how heavy it is. And some of the men are doing this for their own family, but probably their sister's family if she's a single parent or a widow, and so on. So it's a lot of hard work, and it does impact on people's health. And I remember one guy said he needed a surgery on his shoulder, but he would have to fly out for a month to get it. And he said, who's going to get water for all my family if I go for my surgery? So he postponed his surgery, and he still hasn't had it, actually. I was talking to him last week, and that was a couple of years ago. And the thing that really concerns me is mental health. So water insecurity has a big, big impact on mental health. People become obsessed with water. I've become obsessed with water. You can ask my husband, just from living in the community. But you're always wondering, you're always planning ahead about water. And I remember one time a woman phoned me and said, I'm looking at a glass of water on my table, and that's it. That's all I have. It's the only water I have left. The unit is broken. Mike is away, her husband. She was just kind of beside herself. So it's very stressful. I do want to point out that people are very aware, they're extremely aware of all the multidimensional aspects of water insecurity, especially the women in the community. So we would have women's focus groups there, and they would talk about some of the hard choices that they had to make. So they knew, for instance, that Kool-Aid is bad for your kids, and that it's linked to obesity and so on. Yet sometimes some of the water would have a yellowish cast to it because of high iron content. Some of the water from there at times even. And so they would put Kool-Aid in it to get their kids to drink it. And they hated doing this. But the kids had to drink something. And another choice that they would talk about making was that sometimes when the unit was broken down or when the LSD was charging for it, the pop was cheaper. So you could buy bottled water in the store at times, but it was 12 cents a can, a bottle, 12 cents more expensive to buy the water. Now 12 cents might not sound like a lot to many of us, but if you're on $11,000 a year, 12 cents means something, and you've got 4 or 5 kids. So it adds up. So they're making these kinds of very, very stressful decisions. So the mental health aspect, it bothers me quite a lot, and I'm not even living with it. So we tried a pilot project summer before last. So these are domestic rainwater harvesting units, and they're very simple. They're really low tech. And they're made in California. So domestic rainwater harvesting is used a lot in the developing world, especially in Africa. It had never been used in the subarctic before or the Arctic. So we tried a pilot project, and it was the first time this had ever been tried in the subarctic. Let's see. So we bought a bunch of these, and the company gave us a discount, which was nice. So they only cost $100 altogether. So you have the rain saucer, and you just buy these from Home Hardware or wherever. Those kind of like garbage buckets, really, is what they are. I mean, it cost us more to ship them in than it did to buy them. So for $100, you've got this water collection device. Our biggest problem was wind. I know people think Lethbridge is windy, but this was very, very windy. So these pallets are nailed into the ground with these giant stakes, and they're bungee cords. We had to move these ones. It was too windy, put them behind houses. That was the biggest problem with them, was the wind. So for our project, we had 7 households take part. They each were given 2 of these units, and the local service district decided who would take part in the project. And they chose people who were the most water insecure in the community, which mostly female-headed households and a couple of elders' households. There was a lot of community buy-in. They loved the fact that it was low-tech. They were just fed up with the poodoo and all the bits and bobs there. And another thing they had going for them was that there's very heavy rainfall in Labrador in the summertime. Actually, spring and summer. So we thought this might work. So we dealt with the wind. That was the biggest problem, but everything else worked okay. So we had 2, Jaden and Victoria. They're grade 9 at the time, and they were hired for the summer. So they would go to all the houses, and they would measure, keep track of record people's water intake and water use and so on. Now this is not for drinking water. You can't drink water out of this. Well, you can, but we advise people not to. What they did, this is to replace your general use water, so you don't have to go fetch your general use water. So it'll save you a couple of ATV trips and so on, all-terrain vehicle trips. So that was the idea behind it, just to see if an incremental change would help there. And a graduate student went to the community, stayed there most of the summer, and he supervised these students. So there are many results we had. One was that the households that were taking part, they saved $12 a week. Now, $50 a month. They were very, very pleased with that. So $50 it meant a lot to people. So that was their costs were cut back in terms of gas and so on. And sometimes people would pay other people to fetch water, and they didn't have to do that. So the average house saved about $48, $50 a month. The biggest finding, according to the people themselves, was that their mental health improved. They felt much, much better. They felt that something was going on, something good. So they reported that levels of optimism had increased. So I've got a couple of quotes here. I like the look of my unit. I'm a really proud pilot project participant. I love it. And another participant said, thank you for trying domestic rainwater harvesting and opening our eyes. It makes you explore different water options. So they were, it seemed like there was a little bit less time to think about, a little bit of less, what am I trying to say here, pressure to think about water. So I'm getting, a couple of these buckets a week. It's a couple of, I don't have to think about it as much. So since this, their umbrella organization, so that's the general Inuit organization representing all the communities on that coast, Nunatuhavut Community Council, they're working with Black Tickle. It's that and one other community has extreme water insecurity, so they're working together on different ways that they can tackle it. And the units are still in the community. We left them there, and they're still being used. I'll show you a sign that they put up at the end of the summer. Stay strong. Make them wonder why we are still smiling. Black Tickle strong. And I just have that there because Inuit are very, very resilient. And just living with water insecurity is extremely tough. And it requires a lot of strength. And they're aware of that, and they're proud of it. I think it's really important to understand community experiences of water security and water insecurity. And one reason why is that sometimes there are surprises. So I talked about how labor intensive it is. So some men in the community might spend 4 hours a day retrieving water for their family and the family next door. That's really, really hard physical work. And when you look at that, your first thought might be, oh no, that's in 2018, these guys are hauling buckets. That's not good. What some of the men in the community say is, I've been unemployed for a long time since the crab plant closed. And this gives me a chance to do something for my family. I feel like I'm contributing. So they feel like their role is not completely undermined, their traditional role as provider. So that might be a bit of a surprise. And it's why you want to talk to people and see what they think. And I think it's one reason why they like the low-tech solution, because you still have to empty that water out. You still have a chore to do that's attached to it. And another example I can give that Ben Dosu and I have talked about are in Africa, when we look at usually girls, but young people fetching water, and we outright condemn it, because it does have negative impacts on education and so on. And I get all that. But it's interesting because sometimes the parents say they like it when the kids go to fetch water because it's the only time they have privacy. So water security brings in every aspect of life. And you need to address all those kind of outlying things if you're going to have good water security and community development. So we really need to understand community experiences and if we're going to form good policy. So, in conclusion, I'd just like to say that I've talked about a lot of the problems, but there has been significant progress in Canada in recent years in terms of water governance. At the provincial level in particular, some of the provinces have done some good stuff about formulating and implementing stricter guidelines. Walkerton was a wake-up call in many ways, and drinking water protection has been strengthened. There's also been improved source water protection, and then there's an increasing need for an understanding of the need to plan for source water protection and for more robust monitoring and surveillance. However, Canada's legislative and governance frameworks are just not sufficiently robust, as I said, to manage domestic water uses efficiently And we have very serious water injustice problems in this country because we have Indigenous people in so many communities suffering from such severe water poverty. And I think we can do better, and I think we can, and there's some indications that we are going to do better. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.